Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we saw Radha Kumar's distinction between colonial and post-colonial influences on Indian feminisms, tracing its evolution through major historical phases. Initially shaped by colonial modernity and reformist efforts such as by Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, early reforms like the abolition of sati and promotion of widow remarriage often reinforced Brahmanical patriarchy. During the Gandhian era, women entered political life, but largely in roles tied to traditional gender expectations. Post-independence feminism turned to constitutional rights, but by the 1970s, disillusionment led to a more intersectional focus on violence, labor, and bodily autonomy, revealing the limits of universal legal remedies, especially evident in the Shah Bano case. Feminist thinkers like Kumkum Sangari and Uma Chakravarti emphasized intersecting patriarchies, cautioning against homogenized views of womanhood. We also analyzed the role of women's autobiographies in identity formation, particularly within the Anglo-American feminist theory in Indian context. These narratives challenged dominant, individualistic, and masculine forms of autobiography, offering collective, resistant self-representations. Scholars like Barbara Johnson and Sheila Robotham describe the autobiographical self as divided, navigating between cultural imposition and personal experience. This internal split linked the navigating between the cultural imposition of Du Bois' double consciousness. It allows for the emergence of new feminist subjectivities where the bifurcated consciousnesses are now brought together to challenge the dominant ideas regarding gender, gender roles, and so on. In the Indian context, women's autobiographies reveal how Indian woman was historically constructed, especially during colonialism and nationalism. Social reformers such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, on the one hand, have tried to construct an idea of the Indian woman that was very much central to the reformist notions. In the Indian context, the prescriptive texts often promoted an idealized modern woman, educated yet domestically confined. J. Devika calls this the order of gender, where women's freedom was conditional, requiring them to remain moral guardians of the home. A central text discussed in this context in the previous lecture was Raj Sundari Devi's Amar Jivan, which was published in 1876. A pioneering autobiography by Indian woman, which was praised by the male contemporary writers for aligning with the ideals of domesticity and religiosity. Feminist scholars, however, such as Malavika Karlekar and so on, argue that the text subtly resists patriarchal norms. Raj Sundari reclaims the domestic sphere, what she calls the Antahpur, as a site of intellectual agency, learning to read and write in secret. Her desire for knowledge is justified through religious devotion, allowing her to navigate the social constraints. However, the autobiography also reinforces caste and class hierarchies. Rajsundari, from an upper caste family, critiques women working outside the home and presents her life as a universal female experience, thereby excluding lower class, working class, and lower caste women. Scholars such as Partho Chatterjee and Sumanta Banerjee highlight how nationalist discourses shaped a binary between the new woman, who was moral and was an upper caste woman, and the common woman, who was immoral and often belonged to the lower class. Ultimately, Indian women's autobiographies serve as critical interventions, both confronting and contesting dominant gender ideologies. They reflect the complex interplay between individual agency, cultural prescriptions, and nationalist frameworks, offering a nuanced insight into gender identity and self-representation. Today, we will discuss another text that marked a significant contribution to women's writing, both in terms of literary style, the use of dream narratives, science fiction, and in imagining an alternative utopia where women rule the world. We will talk about the story Sultana's Dream, published in 1905, written by Begum Ruqayya. Before going into the analysis of the story, let's begin with a summary. The story Sultana's Dream begins with an attack on Indian patriarchy, who lounge in an easy chair and think lazily of the condition of Indian womanhood. Hence, the moment the female narrator, who is Sultana, begins her discussion about women's position in Indian society, she is unsure whether she is awake or asleep. The moonlit sky, sparkling with thousands of diamonds like stars, indicates that it is still night. But the moment she goes on a walk with Sister Sarah, she finds out that it is a fine morning. Thus, from the very beginning, the narrator, as a representative of women who live in a society dominated by patriarchy, engages in a battle with the dominant discourses that provides us with presupposed definitions and binaries of day, night, awake, asleep, and so on. The sudden appearance of Sister Sarah baffles the narrator, who says, "How she came in, I do not know." Sister Sarah's arrival brings the news of a change. She blurs the edges of binaries and makes the narrator question the dominant social system by providing an example of an alternative society. This story is thus unique in that it does not stop after voicing the concerns regarding women, but seeks to find an answer to it in the form of Ladyland. The knowledge about women's condition, that is the Parda system through which men keep women in Wales, has led women in Ladyland come up with a new methodology where women now run the government in a very scientific and logical manner and have forced men to live behind veils, which they call Mardana. Interestingly, the men who have fought in warfare are all violent. And now that women rule Ladyland with science and logic, peace has come to the land. And the land is also free of any crimes. The women in Ladyland have completely discarded the patriarchal language and have used a new terminology and new meanings to old terminologies. As evident in the replacement of the word Zenana with Mardana, where men stay behind the doors, completely in the shadows under the veil. In the dominant terminology, Mardana refers to male sexual prowess, which is now completely undermined with the new meaning that shows as inefficient and irrelevant, to the extent that women do not even trust them with something as minor as needlework. In the same way, the term mannish, which would come closer to what we refer to as manliness in a patriarchal society, means shy and timid in the ladyland. The narrators comment, shy and timid like men, it was really a joke, is a very poignant male perception where men dominate the society but are seen as shy in the ladyland. Now, the moment the narrator speaks of such perception, she is immediately forced to re-navigate her knowledge about men and women at large when she finds out that her companion is not Sister Sarah but a stranger. And herein we come across a seamless confusion between dream and science fiction. While science fiction focuses on realistic interpretation through the depiction of technology, dream, on the other hand, is fully fictionalized. When the narrator goes to Ladyland, she sees it in her dream. But Ladyland, like science fiction, boasts of scientific and technological advancement. So, in the narrative style, Sultana's Dream also merges these two simply opposite narrative techniques and promotes a sort of feminist writing. This stranger signifies all the alternative ideologies, which brings out the voices of the oppressed. Therefore, concern and fear for strangeness is not so much in terms of visual appearance of Sister Sarah, but in terms of the new morning she brings with her. Sister Sarah's words bring out all the discomforts which the society has always kept aside. It is this dominant voice that speaks through the narrator when she says, I felt somewhat awkward as being a Pardanishin woman. I am not accustomed to walking about unveiled. Ladyland appears with all its grandeur in front of the narrator. Sister Sarah claims that it is free from sin and harm because men no longer run the country and they are not allowed to go outside without veil. Sister Sarah's invitation to the narrator and the reader, saying, Will you please come out and have a look at our garden? Literally implores us to come out of our comfortable closets where we have accepted patriarchy as a norm and come up with new choices. This garden is not the Garden of Eden where Eve is shown as the sole reason for the fall of man. Instead, with the queen as the ruler of women and women holding important positions, the garden of Ladyland flourishes to its utmost level. Women in the Ladyland are not only resourceful, they are efficient in establishing a symbiotic relationship with nature as contrast to men who think it is useless to give so much attention to horticulture while they have so many other things to do. Women, on the other hand, distribute their time equally for every work and hence can complete it in time. Sister Sarah finishes her work in the laboratory in 2 hours, whereas men spend 6 hours doing the same work because they take multiple breaks. This dichotomy indicates the introduction of a new work ethic where women prioritize both embroidery and laboratory work as work in Marxian terms, which is a practice recognized by the society where the laborer gets paid wage for that. Unlike the accepted social system where the housework for women is never counted as paid labor. The very fact that the women of Ladyland have divided their work hours between governmental work, embroidery, and so on show that women do not spend their time in gossiping like men, but spend their time in engaging directly into production of materials. Sister Sarah challenges the conventional and religious cultural justifications for the seclusion of women, which pronounces them as naturally weak. She compares men to lunatics who cannot be trusted outside of doors. She further accuses the narrator that women in the narrator's society are shut up in zananas because they had allowed themselves to be ruled by men. Physical prowess cannot determine one's dominion over the other. It is intellect and ideology that makes one a ruler and other a slave. That is why, even though tiger is physically stronger than man, it is man who puts chains on a tiger. Similarly, it is wrong to predict that men are supposed to rule over women because women who succeed in scientific logic are found in Ladyland. In fact, their scientific and technological innovations bring victory to the country with sheer intelligence, which the physically strong men fail to do in the battle. The text depicts education as a major reason for liberating women. The time when the story was written is 1905, an important time when protests were going on against the British Empire, which decided to divide the Bengal, and women were active participants in these protests. Considered as the Renaissance of Bengal, this era brought the question of women's education to the forefront. Although women were taking part in freedom movements, home was still seen as a sacred place for women. That is why women's education in Bengal, like feminism in India, looked like a group of enlightened men benevolently educating their brides. Women themselves were mostly absent from the public debate about whether women should be educated or not. Even when the question of women's education arose, they usually maintained to make women better wives and mothers. Like the Victorian women, education of women in Bengal created to promote conduct books, books on morality, and so on. As we have discussed this in the previous lectures, specifically on the idea of Indian women and new women. Now, this is why when the Queen of Ladyland circulates the order that all the women in her country should be educated, and especially in science, the question of education gains a different momentum because science was primarily seen as a man's subject, something beyond the capacity of women's brains. Women, however, proved to be more innovative than men in utilizing nature and science for protecting their nation. They utilize science to control rain and heat and create machines to do so. And when women win the battle using the heat controller, they prove that their innovation was not a sentimental nightmare as men had predicted, but is a fruitful application of their brain. It is interesting to note that men agree to go to the Mardanas for the sake of honor and liberty, to predominant male attributes, and eventually get used to the pardas. By the time they claim their freedom, women are already ruling the country successfully, and the Queen pronounces that if their services should ever be needed, they would be sent for, and that in the meanwhile they should remain where they are. Crime is eliminated because the tyrannical men no longer roam about freely. Ladyland freely practices forgiveness because their religion is based on rules, which are not rigid but based on forgiveness. As Sister Sarah claims, the foundations of the religion in Ladyland are love and truth. Now, we are never told whether this love should pertain to heterosexual category or not, but we see a subtle camaraderie between women when the narrator feels shy to hold hands with Sister Sarah. The relationship with men is not bound in social bonding. A distant cousin is as sacred as a brother, says Sister Sarah. Nevertheless, there is always an attempt to make every human interaction sacrosanct. Ladyland is portrayed as the ultimate paradise where no one steals the other's possession, no one covets the Kohinoor. All they are interested is in the welfare of the country. Yet, after everything, hierarchy is maintained in Ladyland. We are told that the Queen's words are ultimate in the land, and how the two lady principals compete with each other at the professional level. The very fact that women study in separate colleges and men must remain in Mardana while women are out in the world show that men and women cannot coexist in the land. One's existence is determined by the absence of the other. The binary thus remains in the land. Ironically, therefore, the society is not much different from the ones ruled by men, because now the gentlemen are kept in the Mardanas to mind babies, cook, and do all sorts of domestic work, but there is no mention of whether they get paid or are acknowledged for their housework. Instead, it is presumed that cooking is so easy a thing, it is simply a pleasure to cook. Plato's Republic and Thomas More's Utopia had no place for women. In a similar way, this utopia is established only by removing men or by keeping them behind the curtains in their proper place where they ought to be. And it is for this reason that we cannot call this a feminist utopia, because feminism proclaims equality. In this ladyland, the roles are simply reversed. One group is always oppressed by the other. Although we do see women's voices emerge, it does not promote equality for all. By the end of the story, Sister Sarah laughs when the narrator says, "We must leave it now, for the gentlemen may be cursing me for keeping them away from the duties in the kitchen so long." But the ladyland can only remain Sultana's dreams. At times, it would seem Sultana is somewhat skeptical about the existence of ladyland. On the one hand, it presents the probable picture of a female utopia. But on the other hand, despite men's absence, anarchy is retained in the society in the form of social and racial hierarchy. Sister Sarah continually accuses Sultana for being an Asian woman, and there is also a sense of superiority in her. That is why the story must end abruptly, and Sultana has to wake up. She must slip and fall out of ladyland. Now, let us summarize today's lecture. Begum Rokea's story, Sultana's Dream, is a pioneering narrative that blends elements of science fiction, dream allegory, and social satire to critique patriarchal norms and imagine a society where women, empowered through education, intellect, and governance, rule the country. The narrative subtly interrogates and mirrors real-world gender inequalities in colonial Bengal, particularly the Parda system and the limitations of women's education. Now, considering the time it was written in 1905, it continues to remain one of the remarkable examples of an imagination. Although the era was growing in terms of women's involvement in nationalist movements, the role of women in debates on education and public life remained minimal. By envisioning a society where the Queen mandates universal education for women, particularly in science, Begum Rokeya pushes against the prevailing norms. However, the utopia is not without its contradictions. Although men are now subordinate, the story reproduces a binary structure where one gender's freedom is still built upon the seclusion of the other. Additionally, class and racial hierarchies also subtly persist. The ultimate irony is that while Ladyland seems an inversion of patriarchy, it still relies on the exclusion to maintain order, thereby mirroring the flaws of male-dominated societies. The story challenges the dominant ideological and social structures by rewriting linguistic and cultural norms that marginalized women. By inverting the Parda system and assigning public roles to women, Rokeya exposes the arbitrariness of gender roles. She innovatively uses the dream form and utopian genre to bypass the constraints of her time and imagine a radical alternative to patriarchal society. The story, however, as we mentioned, is not a feminist utopia as it does not proclaim equality. Nevertheless, the narrative strategy paved the way for future feminist writers to explore speculative fiction as a tool for social critique. Rokeya foregrounds women's access to education, especially science, as the key to liberation, contrasting it with contemporary perception of education as a tool to make women better wives and mothers. Her portrayal of women as intellectual readers were revolutionary for its time. The story situates the question of women's rights within the broader political context of colonial Bengal, subtly critiquing both British imperialism and native patriarchy. In the next lectures, we will learn more about women's writing and activism. Thank you.